Welcome, everybody. We are going to get started in a couple of minutes. Welcome to everyone. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on successful ICH E6R2 implementation. I'm Gary Tyson. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you all today. I'm going to spend a minute introducing myself and have my colleague Matt Healy from Rowe introduce himself before we jump in and do a quick E6R2 overview and talk about what makes for successful implementation, why it's not about the software, and Matt will share something about Rowe's experience implementing E6R2 successfully before we end with time for questions and answers. On the right-hand side of your webinar panel, hopefully you should see a white area that says Q&A. If you have a question anytime during the presentation, just type it in to that Q&A list. We have a colleague who's compiling those questions and will be giving them to us to answer at the end when we have question and answer time. Final bit of webinar administration here. At the end of the presentation, the handout tab will become active and you guys can download this presentation if you find it helpful or you want to pass it on to other people. That will be available to you all. So with that, I'm going to get started. Thanks again to everybody for joining us today. I'll start with some introductions. My name is Gary Tyson. I am a partner and the founder of Pharma Initiatives, which is a consulting firm that specializes in clinical development operations consulting. So we help clinical development leaders implement major operational change. I've been around for probably too long, but over 25 years doing this stuff. And it's been a pleasure having that opportunity working with literally dozens of different clients on a range of different things. I find the E6R2 implementation to be, in my years of experience, one of the more interesting and challenging types of operational change implementations. And so I'm looking forward to telling you guys a little bit about why that is and what I've had a chance to learn having done this a few times. With that, I'll ask my friend Matt Healy to introduce himself.
Thanks, Gary. Good morning or afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. As Gary noted, I'm the Vice President of Clinical Operations here at Rowe. I could not be more pleased to be here with Gary today to talk about what I feel is a pretty timely and important topic for our industry right now. As indicated here in this slide, I've been in the industry a little over 24 years. I started off in academia, mainly working on neuropsychiatric trials, and then moved into the CRO space about 19 years ago. And I've been mainly focused on leading and developing clinical operations side of the industry for the last 15 years. So I and Ro in general was very fortunate to be able to partner with Gary and his team at Pharma Initiatives on the development of what has become our quality risk-based management approach to trial design and execution that is enabling us to ensure compliance with the E6R2 guidance. So I'm particularly excited today for Gary to walk everyone through this methodology, and then as Gary had mentioned, at the end I'll add in some lessons learned and consideration for anyone who's looking to implement a solution like this within their organization. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Matt. I'm incredibly appreciative of Matt and his team, and Matt joining us today is a real win for us. So, the goal of this webinar is not to spend too much time on defining what E6R2 is, but we need to at least all have sort of semi-common language. So I'm going to take a few slides just to do a really brief overview. Right, but hopefully most of you have had some sense of this. But just to put us all into the same context, right? ICH formally defined GCP in what was at the time E6, but became E6R1 when R2 became a thing in 1996. It took a full decade for them to adopt the second version of that, which is E6R2. Which they did in 2016. The EMEA adopted their slightly modified but pretty much the same version in 2017, and then the US placed E6R2 into the Federal Registry in 2018, thus acknowledging it as a standard for once the FDA put it into the Federal Registry, acknowledging it the standard for the US. So it is the definition of GCP today, and it's something that hopefully all of us are thinking about how we can comply with. One of the things I do want to point out is that E6, the R2 version of E6 made literally dozens of addendums and changes to R1 in all these different sections, and we are not going to talk about all of these changes. A lot of them are minor, a lot of them are more associated with technical systems and systems validation. That's not going to be our focus. We're going to focus here on probably the big kahuna, the big change that came in Section 5 related to sponsor responsibilities, which was the responsibility to implement a quality management system. And that was a whole new responsibility that didn't exist before. So that's where most of my clients spend most of their energy implementing E6R2, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Just again, to make sure we're all on the same page about this, we're going to, I'm going to spend just a moment running through what R2 said about quality management systems, because it was frankly a little vague and not super user-friendly. So broadly speaking, they kind of just lay out 7 elements of quality management systems that's required in this definition. So it's the identification of critical processes and data, the identification of risks, the evaluation of those risks, the control, how those risks are going to be controlled, how risks are going to be communicated, how risks are going to be reviewed, and reviewed is a tough term here, I think it's more like managed, and reported. And then it's and then the fact that the process has to be an ongoing loop. So there's a lot of elements here. It's not really helpful to think of this as 7 things. It's a lot more helpful to think of this as sort of 3 steps, and throughout this discussion today, I'm going to be talking about it in terms of 3 steps. So the first step is quality risk assessment and planning, which informally I think of as a shared understanding of the riskiest risks that we face in this trial. The second step is quality risk management, or watching out for those risks and acting before they become a problem. This is where central monitoring lives, and remote monitoring lives, and targeted SDV all lives here in step 2. And then step 3 is really the fact that that R2 acknowledges that what we understand to be the risk at one point in a study is not going to be true as we learn more and we evolve in our understanding. And so therefore, we need to constantly revise and repeat and update this process as we go through. It doesn't have to be every week or every month, but it certainly can't be we define our risk once at the start of a study and then that's supposedly sufficient for the entire life cycle of a study. So there does have to be a reconnection, a revisiting of step one, and not just a continuation of step two. So step one, step two, to a lesser degree, step three, that's what I'm going to be talking about, those big chunks of the process. Before we jump off the general stuff, just make sure we're all, again, in alignment on the key concept here. Why did they add this into revision 2 of GCP? It comes from, from this harsh fact of our lives, which is, we put a lot of work into certain things that don't produce a lot of value. And the classic, of course, being, 100% SDV, and a couple studies have proven it finds less than a 0.25% of errors. That's a lot of work for not a lot of return. And so the whole concept of quality management system is to focus our effort where we're at risk, not just everywhere, but where there's the most risk. And in order to do that, you have to know what your risks are. And so you have to identify those risks in advance. And you have to figure out which of those risks you're going to pay attention to. And only then can you figure out how you can reduce those risks and manage those risks effectively. So that's really the whole concept that underpins the quality management side of E6R2, and that drives philosophically this effort. All of which leads to ultimately the value proposition of E6R2, which is by knowing the study's risks and how we can reduce or detect those risks, we can achieve better study quality as defined by patient safety, patient rights, patient well-being, better integrity of the clinical trial data, improved quality of the primary and secondary endpoints, and then improve study efficiency and hopefully reduce study costs by focusing our attention and our effort where the risks are and not uniformly throughout the entire potential study. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how we can successfully implement those concepts. I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've learned sometimes the hard way. Hopefully you won't have to, and as well as why this should be done in a software agnostic way, at least at the beginning, and we'll talk about that. So just as a quick overview, we're going to look at 5 different things here today in terms of successful implementation, and I'm going to cover each of these in detail. And as I said, I'm going to give you guys the copy of this presentation. I think it'll be available at the end. It automatically pops up or something. So you'll be able to download this. So don't worry about taking notes. Just sort of stick with me here. And again, as you have questions, type them into the question and answer tab on the right, and we'll be happy to answer those at the end, or if we can't get to it at the end, we'll send you an answer. So let's start with the first one, which is we have to avoid the risk here of this becoming a check-the-box exercise. The challenge here is, even though we've never had a formal quality management system process before in GCP, people have been thinking about risks their whole lives, right? Any experienced person who's run a study always thinks about what can go wrong and what do I need to do to avoid that. And as a result, at cursory glance, a lot of this can look familiar to people. Maybe it's never been framed this way, but it kind of looks familiar. And if you're not careful, people can view this as sort of a check-the-box exercise, and that would be a huge mistake. And I've seen this really get in the way of successful implementations, because if people are seeing this as a check-the-box exercise, Lord knows everyone that we work with is incredibly busy, and it's really hard to get people to do new things if they think it's just some kind of check-the-box exercise. And it really isn't. So in terms of our approach, it's key that as you communicate, and there's a lot of communication involved in a successful implementation of E6R2, that you highlight the differences. And some of those key differences are, even though in the past maybe each individual function has looked at the risks, we've never as a standard developed a shared understanding of what those risks are, nor have we developed a shared prioritization or sense of which of those risks collectively are the riskiest for the study. And as a result, everyone's been sort of optimizing their own risks, but not looking at how we can optimize broadly across the study. And that's what E6R2 brings to the table. And it's what enables that value proposition. So you really do want to take that value proposition and keep reiterating it and repeating it, because fundamentally, we've got to avoid people viewing this as a check-the-box exercise first and foremost. They have to view this as a valuable and important change that is going to improve the results, the quality as well as the efficiency of the studies. The next challenge is conceptual. More than any other major operational change, and I've been involved in new ETMS systems and implementing CTMS for the first time for literally dozens of clients. I'm old enough to be there when we introduced EDC for the first time. E6R2 is different. It's much more conceptual, at least in the initial step where you're identifying risks and prioritizing them. And so there is, it's really important as part of any implementation to understand that and to be able to explain these concepts. The challenge is that because it's conceptual and people put a fair amount of thought in there, there's a lot of terms out there that go around with E6R2, a lot of sort of specialized language. And I found that if you have too much specialized language, it can be really hard to understand. And so there's a couple things that I strongly recommend. One is, whenever possible, avoid using new E6R2 specific terms if you can use simplified standard language terms instead. And there's some examples here, but in general, there is a tendency, especially for an implementation team who gets really steeped in this and gets really excited about it, to want to sort of build a whole new lexicon of this language. And while that is cool for them, it makes the implementation that much harder, because now not only are we implementing something, but we have to train people on a whole new lexicon. And that's just, it's not necessary. A lot of this stuff is common sense. It's just sort of being framed in a different way. And so I strongly urge you to avoid that sort of rabbit hole of too much complex language. Use simplified language when you can. The other thing I want to strongly urge you all to do is to leverage visual representations of concepts as much as possible. And I'm going to go through a few examples that I've found are really helpful, but you know, your mileage may vary, and there are other concepts that, you know, might be more important to your groups. But whatever those concepts are that you think are going to be the hardest for people to understand, invest the time and energy to come up with some kind of visual representation of the concept. It will really help people understand things more quickly. So I'm going to go through a few examples. One of the big ones that people struggle with is this idea of how does the benefit of this come about? What is the actual benefit of doing this? And so the way I try to frame this for people is, if you imagine there's a universe of all the quality risks that exist for a study, our E6R2 starts by identifying and prioritizing those risks. Not all those risks are entirely relevant for your study. Not all of them are, even if they're theoretically relevant, are important for their study. Maybe we have a risk that has such a minimal impact on us, it's not worth worrying about. Maybe we have a risk that's so unlikely to occur, it's not worth worrying about. That allows us to sort of narrow our world to a bunch of relevant quality risks, some of which we just choose to accept because maybe the impact of them going wrong is so minor, or there's other reasons why we can accept them. So we can continue to narrow our world down into just the risks that we can't accept, and then we can further reduce those risks through protocol amendments or changes, through other actions we can take that can take something that used to be a risk and make that risk go away, such that we narrow our universe down to just to a much smaller set of remaining risks that we can focus on. And that focus of risks, that's shared and understood by everybody, that's the basis for all the value we get out of E6R2. That's the basis for central monitoring. That's the basis for remote monitoring. That's the basis for targeted SDV. It all comes from the fact that we don't have to treat every risk equally. So showing this concept visually has a huge impact on people, and I can't emphasize enough. Please steal this slide. It is really helpful. I've used it a bunch of times, and it's just super helpful. Another key concept that I would encourage you to take advantage of is people really struggle if they're relatively new to the difference between on-site monitoring, remote monitoring, and central monitoring. And so another visual concept, another visual slide I use is a sort of a visual representation of those different kinds of monitoring. So on-site monitoring, people know what that is, right? But then you sort of layer on this idea of off-site monitoring, that it's kind of got a higher level view. It's sort of a bigger view here than off-site monitoring. It allows us to look at sort of site level issues by looking at the data produced by the site, by looking at site performance, by looking at all the information we can gather about the site. It lets us look at things at the site at a higher level than we can when we're on site looking at doing SDR or SDV. And then central monitoring, which gives us an even higher view, this time at the study level, looking at sites against, from a data point of view, in concert with each other, and sort of factoring in all these other reviews that have always been going on, but maybe haven't had a place to link together so that we're looking at it collectively: the medical review, the data review, the safety review, the stats review. So this visual representation of on-site, off-site, and central monitoring I found to be helpful. I've also used one where on-site monitoring is sort of people on the ground in the weeds, and off-site monitoring is sort of the bird's eye view, and the central monitoring is sort of the hot air balloon, 1,000-foot view. There's a lot of different visual representations, but these three concepts are ones that really lend themselves well, and I would encourage you to take advantage of those. And then the final one I'll share with you is this idea around targeted SDV, because that is where for a lot of people, the rubber meets the road in E6R2, right? A lot of our staff are monitors, and they're out there doing this work, and they just kind of need to understand this concept. And so by introducing this idea that there's maybe 100% potential SDV that could be needed if that's what this line represents, then you have this sort of visual representation of how critical data and processes, which is the first thing we identify as part of the quality management system, those are SDV to the fullest degree possible, because by definition they're critical, right? Then we have data associated with identify risks. Those we want to monitor at a higher degree than data that's not critical and not associated with an identifiable risk, and that's all the remaining data. One thing I will tell you, though, is whenever you talk about targeted SDV, you always need to also mention that targeted SDV should vary based on results. So if you find less errors, then you should be able to do less SDV. If you find more errors, you need to do more. You always want to connect up those, the fact that it's not a static process, that it is a living process based on actual results that are identified. So these three examples, and I could go on, but there's only so much time, are a few visual representations of key concepts. There are a bunch of concepts that are critical to E6R2, and I, again, strongly encourage you to take advantage of visual representations of key concepts. Another key to successful E6R2 implementation is, or another implementation challenge you're going to need to overcome is what I will call initiative fatigue or process fatigue. Everyone is really busy. Everyone is already kind of maxed out. And if you come into E6R2 with the idea that you're going to layer a whole nother sort of infrastructure layer on top of what everybody's doing with a new quality risk team and quality risk meetings and all that, you're going to get tremendous pushback. And frankly, you don't need to do that. You don't need to build a whole new infrastructure to support E6R2. It really should fold into the world that you've already got. So I would encourage everyone to take the No New Teams pledge with me, that E6R2 fits into your existing, you've got to find a way to make it fit into your existing universe. For that step one, those identification of those risks to create a shared understanding of risks, those are extensions of, you can do those during extensions of existing team meetings, often kickoff type meetings or early process meetings. For those step two, watch and act meetings where the central monitoring sort of types discussions, most organizations have some kind of existing study team meetings. You might need to do them more often. You might need to do them with slightly different people, but do take advantage of and co-op existing meetings and teams, and don't build new. It's just going to get in your way, and it's not going to be critical. I will give you this warning, though. At first, those meetings and times you're co-opting are going to have to be, they're all going to have to be lengthened. And at first, they're going to have to be lengthened a lot. There is a significant learning curve in this, and I'm going to get to that in the next point. So you just have to assume that the initial time people are doing these, and these meetings that used to be an hour are going to go much, much longer. But it will get better. It will get better over time. The next concept here, which is a little different, is the difference between E6R2 and a lot of other implementations. I mentioned I've been around a while. I've done a lot of operations improvement. That's kind of what I do for a living. And this is different because in most cases, if you're putting in place a process that's either replacing a similar process that's less efficient or replacing a paper process that's super inefficient. In the case of E6R2, you're not doing that. It's a whole new thing, and it's made up of things that look familiar, but we're doing it in a different way, so it's a whole new animal. And as a result of it being different, applying the old way of doing major operations change, which is, hey, let's figure out what we need, let's define our process, let's get it pretty well buttoned up, and then let's pilot it and then roll it out broadly, quickly. That doesn't really work as well here. So E6R2 is best implemented in kind of a learn by doing approach, a more iterative approach. Given that most people don't have experience doing this, we strongly urge you to take a sort of a conference room pilot-centric approach, and I'll cover what I mean by that on the next slide. But expect, even after this approach, that you're going to be making much more and much more significant changes to the process and tools after the first few live implementations, the first few live pilots, both of step one and of step two, than you would in a normal major operational change. It's just the nature of this beast. It's a learn by doing thing. There isn't a simplified set of best practice that works for everybody. You've got to find your own way a bit, and that's going to require some iteration. So the approach I would recommend is to do a rapid, sort of sketchy design and leverage an existing tool from an industry group, and I'll get to that when I talk about the software in a second, what I mean by tool. Select a past study that's completed, hopefully one that there's at least somebody left in the company who has some familiarity with it. Have your team go through the process with that past study, share the results back with the people who were actually doing the study, who can tell you how well you identified the actual risks and what you missed. That helps. This helps in two ways. One, it helps people go through the process and get an understanding of it and refine the tool, but it also helps us understand where the gaps are in our process and the questions that we're not asking. That will then allow us to gather a bunch of feedback and then revise before we put this in front of our first live pilot. But again, still understanding that when that live pilot happens, you're going to make a bunch more changes. So build fast, update, learn by doing, expect an iterative process. This is a much more circular cycle at the beginning than other major operational changes you might have been involved in. Last implementation success factor, and then we'll jump into looking at, discuss the software side of things. There is a common mistake. Again, this comes with analogies of the past kind of operational changes we've made as most of us, to want to do sort of a big training and roll this thing out to everybody. That is not a good approach here for E6R2. For E6R2, you want to do just-in-time training, which is hopefully common for other major systems rollouts. As people start using the system, you train them. But you need to do it in two parts, step 1 and step 2. I'll talk in a second about why you need to do it in two parts, but just you need to do it just-in-time training about a week ahead of each of those two parts. And then you really got to provide a mentor for the first step 1 process and for the first couple iterations of the step 2 process. So remember, step 1 is where we define what our risks are and evaluate them and prioritize them. That's something we do at the start. And then step 2 is that central and remote monitoring process. That's an ongoing thing we do every couple months or every quarter or every month, depending on the study and the timing of the study. So the first couple iterations of that step 2 process, they should have a lot of mentoring. Certainly the first iteration of the step 1 process, they should have that. You can draw those mentors from your implementation team who've hopefully gone through the conference room pilot, as well as been there to support the first couple live pilots. But regardless, everyone needs a mentor at the beginning. And I would also suggest that the mentors manage the tools initially. And again, we'll talk more about the tools in a moment when we talk about the software side of things. So just-in-time training, really important. Why break it up between step 1 and step 2? And mainly just a practical thing, right? There's a giant gap between step 1 being worked by a group and step 2, this iterative process happening. You know, step 1 is part of the planning process. We should be doing it sort of in order to feed into things like the monitoring plan and the data management plan and all these other plans. So it's very early on. And step 2 can't really start until we have enough data to analyze. And oftentimes that's months and months after we've done those initial planning. So we just want to make sure we're not training people on anything too far in advance. So with that, I'm going to go and focus a little and talk a little bit about why it's not about the software. And in doing that, I'm going to always harken back to this model, because when you look at the software solutions out there, and I should start by saying I ain't got nothing against software. I spend a lot of my time, I work with a lot of my clients on successfully implementing software. So this isn't someone who's humbug on software. I love good software, but there's reasons why I'm suggesting we take a slightly different approach here. The first thing to understand is that the software market right now has some software that supports step 1 and some software that supports step 2, but not all software supports both. So, because it's a very different thing, right? One is risk identification and tracking, and the other is sort of data analysis work. And so you can imagine why some software vendors are stronger in one than the other. So I just want to, so when I talk about this, I'm going to talk about it in terms of step 1 and step 2, just so we're all on the same page. In terms of overall, though, why not pick a solution and go with that and let that sort of drive your process? I understand the desire to do that, but you got to bear a couple things in mind. All these systems are relatively new. All these vendors have not been around a super long period of time. Not that I'm casting any dispersions on them. I'm sure they're all good people, but they're all relatively new. And those of us who have been around long enough, and I've been around long enough to have actually implement EDC for the first time in some big clients, know that software vendors that are new sometimes aren't there in 2 or 3 years. So one reason to be cautious about picking any one solution and building your whole approach around it is we don't really know who's going to be there for a while. We also don't know exactly how these systems are going to sort of evolve out, because they're still very much under evolution and they're still very much being developed. So my advice to my clients at this stage is to build your E6R2 processes in a software agnostic way. Again, not that we might not future want to use software, but when we're building it now, we should build it in a systems agnostic way, in a way that doesn't rely on any one solution. And I'll start by, I'll jump into each of the sort of areas where solutions can be relevant and talk about why I believe that to be the case. So let's start with the step one solutions, the solutions that help us identify and prioritize risks. There are good solutions out there, as I said. The vendors have built what I'll call robust solutions, but the problem with robust solutions that work for lots of different people is that they can be overly complex, especially overly complex for people who are just learning these systems. And it can be really hard to implement these sort of overly complex solutions. The good news is, though, that there are excellent spreadsheet tools available. So you are going to need some tool to write down all these risks and evaluate them and prioritize them, but there are excellent spreadsheet tools that are available. And there's a great tool available from Transcelerate for free. There's an even better tool available from the Metrics Champion Consortium to those people who are a member of the Metrics Champion Consortium, which is a relatively low cost. It's not expensive, and it is well worth it because they built on the Transcelerate tool and made an even better version of it. But these spreadsheet tools are sufficient at least to get you guys up and going and build your understanding and build your approach before you think about purchasing software and configuring it to meet your needs, right? It's really hard to know what your needs are until you've gotten into it. And by using a spreadsheet like this, you have complete control. So if you want to add another column to track something, or you think that there's too much detail and cut out a couple columns, it's entirely your call, and it doesn't require working with the software vendor. We all know how to manage spreadsheets. We also know that spreadsheets are inherently, have inherent challenges in terms of managing and all these other things. So I'm not saying that 5 years from now you're going to be using a spreadsheet for step one. I am saying, though, as you implement initially, you should seriously consider just starting with one of these spreadsheet solutions. In terms of step two, it's kind of a different animal. So step two software is data aggregation and visualization tools. That's what it is. It's software that gathers up data from multiple sources and allows you to visualize that information. In this case, we're looking at information to help us identify risks. So it's things like key risk indicators like number of PDs or number of AEs or things like that. And what the software does is it allows you to easily identify, oh, wow, these three sites seem to have much higher rate of PD than all the other sites in our study. And so it lets you sort of easily visually identify who isn't in alignment with everyone else and who might be experiencing a risk. So that's great stuff, right? It's really helpful to have software aggregation and visualization tools. The thing is, a lot of you guys already have those. So you've already got some kind of data aggregation or visualization capability. You've already invested in some kind of data lake or data warehouse or data, whatever the term of the year is. And I'm not saying those tools are perfect. Probably they're highly imperfect. But they have the advantage of being already paid for. And you guys probably already understanding how to use them, or at least kind of how to use them. So again, if you don't have a data aggregation visualization tool, I'm 100% that you need one and you should get one. If you've already got one, maybe see if you can find a way to make what you've already got work rather than buy a new E6R2 data visualization tool. After you gain some more experience doing central monitoring and remote monitoring, and you get a better sense of what you need, it might make much more sense at that point to go with one of these third-party step two data visualization and aggregation tools. Last point I'll make on this data aggregation side of the step two tools, please be aware if you do go with them, you've got to feed the beast, right? You've got to provide that software with the data, and getting that, if you don't already have a data aggregation methodology, getting that data out and getting it to this vendor is no small job. So you've got to factor that into your thinking when you think about using these tools. The last point I'll make before I hand things over to Matt about Step 2 software is that a lot of them have some kind of issue tracking capability. So this idea of I use the software to see where I have outliers, and then if I have an outlier, I say, oh, I better do something about that. And so I can note an issue or a concern or an action I want to take. The concern I have about my clients using the issue tracking capability of these software is that you've already probably got an issue tracking capability somewhere, likely in your CTMS system, because that's how you've been tracking all your issues up to this point. And if you're putting issues in two different systems, I mean, you guys know you don't want any one thing that's related in two different systems. It can lead to confusion. So if you do choose to work with one of these Step 2 systems, just be careful about putting your issues in multiple places. It's only going to lead to confusion. So with that, I am going to hand things over to Matt, who's going to share with you Ro's experience implementing E6R2. And again, if you have questions, please do pop them into the Q&A section on the right-hand side.
Perfect. Thanks, Gary.
Sure,
so I think what I'll do first is just kind of set the stage a little bit into who Ro is. We are a privately held full-service CRO, which was founded in 1984, and we're based here in Research Triangle Park. And Ro's service offerings span the gamut from pre-IND support and strategy all through the different phases of the clinical development life cycle, including NDA and BLA submissions. So we do it all. And we pride ourselves on a creative and adaptive approach to clinical trial execution. And it's been particularly rewarding for me and the team that we brought together to develop the process over the last year to implement this risk-based quality management methodology. So as Gary had noted in his presentation, our ability to focus on those data and processes that matter, we believe is a huge value not only to our clients, but to all the subjects participating in the trial as well as our sites. So in regards to data integrity and patient safety, we feel like this is a real value add. So what you see here on this slide, and we at Ro here often like to brand our initiatives with some type of Roism. And I've taken a lot of good-natured ribbing about this in different meetings, so feel free to send forth the puns. But for this particular initiative, we branded the initiative RoQual. So for our quality-based quality management process, we've named the implementation team that. So together with Pharma Initiatives, the team was made up of a cross-functional selection of stakeholders at Ro that represented all of the functional areas. So ClinOps, project management, data management, biostatistics, medical monitoring. It's really important, and it was really important for us to have, all the different stakeholders giving input into the development of the process. For the data aggregation and visualization that drives looking at certain data-driven KRIs, and I will say not all KRIs, will be utilized or will be looked at through your data aggregation tool. Some KRIs that you will identify just don't lend themselves to that and will be tracked elsewhere. But Ro has chosen to partner with TRI, who have a centralized monitoring platform called Opera. And when appropriate, Ro utilizes this platform for the Step 2 of the process that Gary reviewed just previously. Currently, we are exercising Step 1 of the process, both at the pre-award and the post-award stages of the study initiation process. We feel that the earlier that we can begin thinking about and narrowing down risks and how to build in quality, the better chance we have of implementing and any mitigating strategies and setting up the study for success. So that's kind of where we are now. And then on the next slide, we move into some of the key learnings. I'm just going to talk about what we experienced during the process. So the process design team did an excellent job of developing the process. However, as we all know, it's not really until you begin running through the process in a non-theoretical type environment that it will make sense. So I would absolutely re-emphasize everything Gary said about the value of having a conference room pilot. We did that with Pharma Initiatives, and it was extremely valuable. in getting us ready for that real first pilot. One thing that was important, and I would advise anyone undertaking this type of initiative, is to ensure that you have the correct team assembled, as I just mentioned, and all the relative stakeholders are providing their input. And you're wanting to ensure that the process that you're developing is well balanced across all functional area. Coming back to that shared understanding that Gary talked about in the beginning, to make sure that it's a true shared understanding across the entire functional areas. And then to ensure that we had a central role that would serve as a point of expertise and experience, we've implemented what is called our quality risk manager role. In other organizations, you might hear this called something differently, but basically this role will serve to oversee and facilitate the risk assessment and the centralized monitoring process throughout the duration of the study. Again, if you have this role in place that's doing this in some other form or function, leverage that as well. And then I think communication is key. Having a plan and keeping everyone up to date and engaged is going to be a huge key to success. Developing a process like this can be extremely challenging when you've got so many component parts to it that keeping everyone on the same page and driving decision-making can be very much a challenge. So routine meeting schedules and action item tracking was key for us. The other consideration that should be taken into account is how communication around what will likely be a significant change for the organization is cascaded out to your larger organization. I know Gary just talked about this. At Rowe, we developed a series of communications that we rolled out the process, beginning with a larger concept, and then with each subsequent communication or pseudo training, we were narrowing the focus to the more specific aspects of the process. And then I think the last item I would advise on is not to underestimate the level of effort in planning for and working with the data aggregation and visualization tool. At Rowe, we ended up organizing a second technical team for the Rowe Qual process, and these folks were charged with just understanding the intricacies of system validation, data extraction, data importation, all that. And it was definitely, for us, more challenging and a deeper dive than I know that I was anticipating when we put that group together. So absolutely something to keep in mind as you're moving forward with this. And I think that is all I have.
Yep. So thank you, Matt. And Matt and I are both going to be open for questions, and we've already gotten a bunch. I'm going to actually I'll facilitate here this questions and answer period, and the first one is from Stephanie R. And Matt, maybe you can address this. She asks, does E6R2 implementation require an additional new plan? And by this I'm like a quality risk management plan. You want to talk about that?
Sure. At Rowe, we have chosen to implement or to create a new plan template that we will be utilizing. It's called the Integrated Quality Risk Management Plan. You can find the templates for these plans in a lot of different places. I know Avoca has them, and other organizations have them available as well. But yes, we have developed this plan, and basically the way we are going to be utilizing the Integrated Quality Risk Management Plan is those risks that we identify and categorize for tracking as part of the step one of the process will be documented in our Integrated Quality Risk Management Plan, and then that will in turn inform the different functional area plans, whether that be your CMP, your Project Management Plan, Data Management Plan. Then those plans will in turn point back to the IQRMP. So they kind of work together in that way.
Cool. And if you guys need a follow-up question after your question, don't hesitate to pop it into the question dialogue here. Next one is from Karen. If SDV is proven not to be value add, how do we justify increasing and decreasing SDV in response to managing risks? And I think, Karen, that's exactly the point that E6R2 is trying to make is that SDV is not a one-size-fits-all, right? That certain pieces of data are way, way, way more important than others. And so it starts with critical data and processes, which are related to either subject safety and well-being or primary and secondary endpoints. That data is much more important than other data, and we should not be treating all of our data equally. So it is worth investing. The theory goes it is worth investing a lot of time for probably still very little in terms of actual errors being caught for data that is so critical to subject safety, like informed consent information and other things, or for primary and secondary endpoints, which are going to be the basis for major, FDA approval ultimately and physician treatment, than it is for other like interesting or nice to know or rounding out kind of data, like about the subject background and other things. And so the key element here is, until you know what the different kinds of data are, you can't treat them differently and you can't associate different levels of risk with them. So that's why we need to start the process with identifying those. So it was a good question. And then Michael had a question. In your opinion, where besides issue tracking in a CTMS, does CTMS help adhere to E6R2 guidelines? Matt, I think I'm just going to jump in and answer this one too.
Sure.
A couple answers to that, Michael. If you track your PDs in CTMS, as more and more of my clients are doing, because EDC tracking of PDs requires certain compromises that don't have to get made if they're tracked in CTMS, then that PD information is critical. There's other site performance information that you can get out of CTMS that can serve as key risk indicators that can be associated with direct risks. So PDs are sort of one of the most obvious and ongoing and common key risk indicators across almost all studies. And so, getting that data out of CTMS can be critical. And then there's other risks that are sort of study specific, some of which of that data is in the CTMS system, and that needs to float into that data aggregation and visualization tool that we've talked about. So, so that's where CTMS can be critical. Beyond that, though, E6R2 really isn't a CTMS thing. CTMS is supportive, but it's not the tool that you will be doing E6R2 work in. It is more of a generator of data out to and a repository of issues coming from than it is a sort of core system for E6R2. Okay, go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say, the only other thing I might add to that, Gary, in regards to CTMS is, as a result of, how your risk assessment and how you're going to organize your monitoring schedule, you potentially could have different types of visits supported in CTMS as a result of your risk assessment. So if you're going to move some of that on-site activity to off-site activity, the remote visits, your CTMS could support tracking those remote visits as well in support of.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt. That's a great catch. Yes. Yeah. Off-site remote visits should be treated in a CTMS very much like a regular visit, just a traditional visit. It's just that it's not done on site. But it require some modification of your trip report template or some decisions about NAing out a bunch of questions in your trip report template. So that is clearly a consideration. Thanks for catching that, Matt. And there was another question for you, Matt, here. This one's from Iqbal. In a CRO, how will BD employees be impacted by E6R2?
It's a good question. So we've had chosen to include them at the very beginning, and almost the very beginning of the development process of our E6R2 solution. So they have here at Rowe, our BD group, in collaboration with Gary and his team, have undergone a training or several trainings on not only the process, but also on the data analytics tool as well. And we've developed, talking points and informational sheets that we can share with our clients that support the BD in their activity. I think that in the beginning, it's a lot of them just observing those people that are experts in the beginning or who have been very much part of the process, partnering with them in a real way to make sure they understand. But yep, bring them in early and make sure they understand.
Great. Thank you. Still have time for some more questions, you guys. And again, if we don't get to all of them, we will follow up. I got a question from Mary. In addition to reading E6R2 guideline documents from the FDA, are there other training materials or materials that you might recommend? Yes. I mentioned a couple already, and those are the ones I'd focused in on. Transcelerate has done great work in this space, and they're an industry a consortium entity that has tackled a bunch of broad industry issues. I think they've done a lot of great high-level conceptual stuff. And then I would strongly urge you guys, if you're doing this, to become a member of the Metrics Champions Consortium and read. They've done a lot of work in this space around E6R2 and some very, very practical work. I think the knock I'd give Transcelerate, although I have great respect for them, is that their work is sort of high level and theoretical. The Metrics Champions Consortium is full of very practical people who want to make this a reality in their world and have come up with some practical ways of managing this. So I would strongly urge you guys to look at those materials. Matt, is there any other sources that you might think of that would be helpful for people?
I think at this point, you'd be really hard-pressed if you're attending any industry conference to not have this weaved into the agenda some way or another. I know that last year at DIA, there were probably a dozen presentations on this topic. So I think that it's pretty prevalent now within the industry to have these information sessions at these conferences.
Okay. And then another question for you, Matt, this one from Karen. Would you, you mentioned working with TRI for step 2, would you recommend using them for step 1, or did you use an in-house tool?
No, so TRI is developing their solution for the step 1 of the process. But, as we are new to the process and we're learning it and we wanted to make sure it worked for us, we worked, again, with the Aries group, and we've created our own risk assessment tool in-house that we are using. I will tell you that it is based heavily on the MCC tool that Gary just mentioned there. But for our purposes, and since we wanted to be very system agnostic, we chose to create our own risk assessment tool in-house. And for the foreseeable future, I think we'll go ahead and utilize that.
Okay. Thank you, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Next question is, hold on, I just got modified on me. What concepts were the most difficult for people to understand as you rolled out E6R2? This is from Vasily. I think we talked about some of them. This idea of one of them that I didn't talk about was how do you evaluate risks? This is sort of a new concept for people. I think everyone's comfortable with the idea of risks, but how do you formally and consistently evaluate risks? That can be a challenging concept. There's a lot of good information out there about ways to do it in terms of you evaluate the risk in terms of its impact and its likelihood and its detectability. Those are the three vertices basically used to evaluate a risk. But explaining what those mean and explaining the rating system that you use, because right now in the industry, for those three things, there's people who use a 1 to 3 score, people who use a 1 to 5 score, people who use a 1 to 8 score. It can get pretty there can be a lot of variation on a theme, and it can be really confusing to try to differentiate what an impact score of 3 is versus an impact score of 4, or a detectability score of 1 is versus a detectability score of 2 on a 3-point scale. So I will say that having a visual tool to lay that out and explain to people, and then having a whole bunch of examples, real practical examples, is going to be important as you guys roll this out in your environments. So with that, we're pretty much out of time. This went way faster than I thought. But thank you so much to Matt for participating in this. I want to point out that in the white bar on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a tab that says Handouts, and right now there is a document there, which is the PDF of this presentation that Matt and I just covered with you. So please do avail yourself of that. If you have other questions, in fact, a question just came up that we're not going to be able to answer, but we will email you a response to your question, and also just send an email to follow-up email to everybody to ask you to please evaluate the webinar so we can learn more from this experience on our end. And if you have any other questions, Matt and my email are right up here. We would encourage you to send us an email, and we'd be happy to get back to you all. Thank you for sharing an hour of your time with us today. We hope you found it informative, and look forward to doing these kinds of presentations in the future.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, everyone.